Long before the first cities rose from the dust, the world drowned. Across continents and centuries, different civilizations remembered the same story. A flood so vast it seemed to wash the earth clean of everything that came before. In ancient tablets, in weathered carvings, and in sacred texts, the same images appear: dark skies, endless water, and a vessel carrying the last trace of life. Tonight, we look beyond legend, through geology, archaeology, and memory, to ask a simple question with impossible weight. What if the story of the Ark was not a story at all? Settle in, dim the lights. And if you'd like more quiet journeys into the forgotten chapters of our planet's past, remember to subscribe before you fall asleep. Now, let's begin. Long before cities shimmered under the sun, before the first scripts carved symbols into clay, the world was ruled by water. It fell from the sky, it slept beneath the ice, it drifted through the air in quiet breath. Everywhere it moved, life followed, and sometimes life fled. Among the earliest stories ever told, one theme returns like the tide, a flood that ended everything. The words change, the mountains change, the gods have different names, yet the rhythm is identical: rain, terror, silence, renewal. In the absence of written history, that repetition becomes its own kind of record. On the plain once called Sumer, clay tablets preserved a man who built a great vessel before the storm. His neighbours mocked him until the clouds arrived. When the waters receded, he released birds to search for land, and one returned with a leaf in its beak. Thousands of kilometres east, in the valleys of the Indus, another story spoke of Manu, a wise man warned by a divine fish. He bound the fish to his boat with rope, and together they rode the flood until the peaks of the Himalayas appeared. Across the ocean, the Maya remembered 4 brothers who survived the great drowning of the sky. Far north, the Finns sang of a world of ice that melted into endless rain. Each story was shaped by local soil and climate, yet the architecture of memory remained the same. It was as if scattered civilizations shared fragments of a single dream, one so vivid it could not be forgotten. For centuries, scholars dismissed this common thread as coincidence. The ancients, they said, lived close to rivers. Floods were their constant fear. But coincidences rarely leave fingerprints in stone. Along the banks of the Tigris, archaeologists uncovered layers of mud more than 2 meters thick, packed between centuries of normal habitation. The clay dated to roughly 7,000 years before the present, too sudden to be seasonal, too widespread to be local. Far from Mesopotamia, geologists examining the shores of the Black Sea found shells of marine species that should not exist there at all, lying above sediments of freshwater life. Something enormous had breached the boundary between salt and sweet, turning a lake into a sea almost overnight. And deeper still, in Greenland's ice cores, in the tiny bubbles of trapped atmosphere, scientists found chemical scars of a climate collapse. The planet had lurched from cold to warmth in less than a human lifetime. When glaciers the height of mountains began to break apart, they did not melt politely. They shattered, releasing walls of water that raced across continents. To the people who watched from low valleys, it must have seemed that the horizon itself was moving. The ending of the last ice age was not gentle. Between 15 and 10,000 years ago, Earth's temperature swung like a pendulum. Forests advanced, then retreated. Animals migrated only to vanish again. Entire regions that had once been dry grassland disappeared beneath new coastlines. the shallow world where humanity learned to fish, to farm, to speak, gone. The survivors would one day call that loss the flood. Imagine living at the edge of such a change. The days grow warmer, the rivers swell, the air tastes of iron. Hunters climb to higher ground, carrying tools of stone, and memories of fields now drowned. Children ask if the sea will stop climbing. Their elders have no answer. The sky darkens for weeks at a time, and thunder becomes the voice of gods. In the absence of instruments, they recorded the disaster in the only language they had: story. Story could cross generations. It did not rust, it did not erode. A tale whispered by firelight could survive longer than any monument. So they told of a warning sent to one family, of animals gathered 2 by 2, of rain that refused to end, of a vessel resting on a mountain when the world was quiet again. The story changed its name as it moved from tribe to tribe, but its pulse never faltered. When writing finally arrived, it found that story waiting for it. In Sumer it became Ziusudra, in Babylon Utnapishtim, in Canaan Noah. Each civilization believed it was recording something sacred, yet all were transcribing the same echo, the memory of water. Modern science gave the echo new forms. Oceanographers charted ancient shorelines hundreds of kilometers from today's coasts. Divers in the Persian Gulf discovered traces of river channels now hidden beneath the sea, suggesting that once a vast fertile plain had connected Arabia to India. At the same time, satellite mapping revealed the ghostly outlines of structures beneath the Black Sea, as though an entire culture had been sealed away under layers of silt. It is possible that humanity's oldest collective trauma was not war or hunger, but drowning. A generation watched its world dissolve, and every child of that generation carried the memory forward. What they called punishment or purification may simply have been physics. Yet within that physics, a symbol formed, one that promised hope, a boat, a refuge, a chance to begin again. Some anthropologists believe that myth served as emotional architecture, a way for survivors to impose meaning on catastrophe. Others suspect that the flood story is a deliberate preservation of information, instructions coded in allegory, to remember that waters rise, that mountains fall, that survival requires preparation. Each retelling, from clay tablet to scripture, kept that instruction alive. If so, the Ark is less an object than an idea. It is memory given shape, a vessel not of wood, but of knowledge. When people speak of animals 2 by 2, perhaps they are describing biodiversity in the language of symbol. When they speak of divine warning, perhaps it was the slow murmur of weather itself. What matters is not weather. The Ark still rests on a mountain top, but that the world once felt the need to build it. For in the face of endless rain, humans imagined endurance, and in imagining it, they found a way to survive long enough to tell the tale. By the time the skies cleared, shorelines had redrawn themselves. Old camps lay beneath the sea. New rivers wandered through valleys where glaciers once stood. The people who returned to those valleys would find shells on mountain slopes and the bones of fish in dry caves. To them, the evidence was undeniable. The world had drowned and been born again. They rebuilt their homes on higher ground and taught their children to fear the sea. Centuries later, priests would call that fear reverence. Poets would call it divine justice. But at its heart lay something simpler, the memory of what water can do when it forgets its place. The flood myths, scattered across the world, maybe humanity's first science lesson disguised as religion. They remind us that nature's patience is not infinite, and that civilization rests on a shore more fragile than it seems. To remember the flood is to remember humility. And still the question lingers. If the legends describe a real event, where did it begin? Was there one valley, one river basin, one ancient people who first watched the waters climb? Or did the planet itself flood in pieces, different deluges stitched together into a single human memory? That is where our search begins. The story of the flood never faded. It lingered in scripture, in temple walls, in lullabies spoken to calm a child when thunder came. But for most of written history it remained a matter of faith rather than evidence, until a handful of explorers began to ask whether myth could be mapped. In the 19th century, when European archaeologists first dug into the mounds of Mesopotamia, they were not searching for a deluge. They sought empires, kings, and lists of tribute. Yet beneath the dust they uncovered tablets covered in wedge-shaped script, older than any Bible they had ever read. One of them told of a man who survived a flood so great that the gods themselves regretted sending it. It described a boat built to measurements, sealed with pitch, and filled with the seeds of every living thing. The discoverers, holding clay that had survived 4,000 years, realized they were reading an ancestor of the story of Noah. News of that tablet raced across the world. Scholars argued that the Hebrew account must have borrowed from Babylon. Theologians claimed the opposite. But somewhere between the arguments, the boundary between scripture and sediment began to blur. If one ancient culture could record a real flood in poetic language, perhaps others had done the same. As decades passed, geology became the new scripture. Scientists learned to read the earth itself. Lines in stone became paragraphs. Layers of sand became sentences, each marking an age of calm or catastrophe. In river deltas from Egypt to China they found abrupt boundaries, coarse, chaotic layers of debris lying between fine silts of ordinary years. Each layer spoke of water that had arrived violently and then withdrawn. Each layer whispered the same refrain. It happened here too. Far from deserts and palaces, in the quiet of the North Atlantic, researchers studying deep-sea cores found evidence of sudden pulses of meltwater pouring into the ocean roughly 12,000 years ago. These pulses matched the moment when climate graphs spiked, when rainfall grew wild and shorelines shifted. The world's temperature rose, then fell again, as if gasping for air. What humans remembered as 40 days of rain may have been the echo of centuries of instability compressed into a single inherited nightmare. Near the end of the 20th century, oceanographers at Columbia University proposed a theory that reignited the debate. They suggested that the modern Black Sea had once been a freshwater lake surrounded by human settlements. When the last glacial dams of the Mediterranean burst, seawater rushed northward through the Bosporus at a force no one could survive. The lake rose hundreds of feet. Entire villages disappeared beneath it. Those who fled would later tell of a flood sent by heaven. To their children, it would sound like judgment. To their grandchildren, it would sound like myth. Explorers followed the theory into practice. In the late 1990s, expeditions using side-scan, sonar discovered rectangular shapes buried in silt along the old shoreline, stone foundations where fish now swim. Carbon dating placed them at the very boundary between the Ice Age world and our own. A few archaeologists dismissed the structures as natural formations, yet the images persisted, silent but persuasive, proof that humans had lived and built where today only tides remain. Elsewhere, evidence surfaced in the unlikeliest of places. In the Persian Gulf, once a vast plain with 4 mighty rivers, sediment maps revealed the ghost of ancient channels converging in what could have been a cradle of early civilization. When the sea invaded that valley, it did not merely erase villages, it displaced languages, gods, and stories that would later blossom across continents. Perhaps the flood did not travel the world. Perhaps the people who survived it did. The puzzle of the Ark drew another kind of seeker as well, the ones who climb rather than dive. Mount Ararat, the dormant volcano in eastern Turkey, became their compass point. For centuries, travellers reported finding strange wooden beams high above the tree line. In 1916, a Russian aviator claimed to have spotted the outline of a gigantic ship frozen into the glacier, but the report vanished amid revolution. Decades later, aerial photographs and satellite scans reignited the legend. Teams of explorers scaled the mountain, returning with fragments of wood that some laboratories declared ancient and others ordinary. No consensus ever emerged, yet the dream refused to melt. Perhaps, as some suggested, the Ark was never a single vessel but a memory of many. Boats, barges, and rafts that carried families through regional floods, their stories fusing over millennia into one enduring myth. Modern geology has little patience for miracles, but it allows space for catastrophe. The late Pleistocene world was a stage of extremes, vast ice sheets to the north, monsoons to the south, restless oceans in between. Rivers burst their banks, lakes overtopped their rims, and coastlines redrew themselves with terrifying speed. For prehistoric farmers who had just begun to anchor their lives to stable seasons, such violence would have felt divine. To watch your fields drown is to watch your future erased. When everything you understand collapses in water, faith is not a choice, it is an instinct. And yet, hidden beneath the terror, the flood myths contain a remarkable optimism. They are not tales of extinction, but of continuity. They insist that something survived, that knowledge or species or spirit endured long enough to begin again. From a scientific view, that optimism mirrors reality. After each catastrophe, life returned more diverse than before. From a human view, it explains why the story still soothes us even as it frightens us. To believe that someone once built an ark is to believe that there is always a way through the storm. The search for physical proof continues. High resolution. Bathymetry now maps drowned landscapes in minute detail. Underwater drones drift through darkness where fires once burned. Every expedition begins with skepticism and ends with silence. The silence of deep water pressing against the hull, the silence of ancient wood perhaps only imagined. But even when they find nothing, explorers admit to a strange reverence. They are following not just a myth, but a memory older than writing, a whisper shared by all our ancestors. In universities, new disciplines, geomythology, paleoclimatology, try to translate those whispers. They compare oral traditions with sediment data, aligning verses with isotope curves. Sometimes the match is uncanny. A Polynesian tale of stars vanishing behind storms coincides with volcanic aerosols in ice cores. A Chinese legend of a river reversing its course mirrors the break of a glacial dam in Tibet. Each correspondence blurs the line between imagination and record. If the flood was a collective trauma, then humanity's oldest form of therapy was storytelling. By repeating the horror, by giving it structure and purpose, our ancestors transformed chaos into meaning. And meaning, once spoken aloud, becomes survival. When we look back through this lens, the Ark is no longer a divine anomaly. It is an early technology of resilience. The instinct to prepare, to gather, to protect against nature's unpredictability, that instinct has never left us. Every dam, every levee, every spacecraft carrying seeds and DNA samples into orbit is a descendant of that first imagined vessel. The story of Noah, of Ziusudra, of Menu is not only about the past, it is a mirror held to the future. As this first chapter closes, the question remains open, as wide and deep as the sea itself. Did one catastrophic event give birth to all the tales? Or did the Earth teach the same lesson again and again until humanity could no longer forget it? The evidence hides in silt, in fossils, in our own genetic memory. Each clue leads to another, and each discovery feels less like revelation and more like recognition. We have always known that the water can return. What we have forgotten is how quickly it can happen, and how fragile the line between myth and memory truly is. The story of the Ark begins not with a man or a mountain, but with ice. For nearly 100,000 years, glaciers ruled the world. They advanced and retreated like slow tides of glass, carving valleys, crushing forests, building continents of frozen light. To the creatures that lived beneath them, the Ice Age must have felt eternal. But nothing on Earth lasts forever. Around 20,000 years ago, the sun's orbit shifted ever so slightly, tilting warmth back toward the poles. Snow that had lain untouched for millennia began to soften. Tiny rivulets formed, merging into streams that ran beneath the ice, cutting hidden rivers through the dark. From these unseen tunnels the great melt began. At first the change was gentle, water whispering beneath mountains. Then the glaciers started to fracture. Cracks opened wide enough to swallow forests. Entire valleys filled and overflowed. Every year the sun climbed a little higher, and every year the world grew wetter. When scientists core through ancient sediments today, they find the fingerprints of this slow catastrophe. Oxygen isotopes in shells mark rising temperatures. Layers of silt show rivers bursting free of their frozen prisons. It was the planet itself awakening, stretching after a long sleep. As the ice withdrew, it left behind enormous lakes, some larger than modern seas. North America held one called Agassiz, a basin so vast that waves crashed on distant shores no human would ever see. In Europe, glaciers dammed valley across the Alps and Scandinavia. To the south, meltwater poured into basins that would become the Caspian and the Black Sea. For a time, these lakes balanced on the knife edge of their containment. Then, one after another, they failed. When a glacial dam breaks, it does not trickle, it explodes. A wall of water and ice races outward, faster than sound, flattening forests and shifting boulders the size of houses. Geologists call these scars scablands. The people who witnessed them called them the wrath of the gods. Across what is now the Pacific Northwest, you can still see the marks, channels gouged into basalt, coulees twisting through desert, ripples in stone 20 meters high. Each ripple is the frozen motion of a flood that lasted only days, yet reshaped entire states. Events like this happened again and again across the world as the Ice Age died. Around 12,900 years ago, a final cold snap, the younger Dryas, gripped the planet. Then, almost overnight in geological terms, it ended. Temperatures soared, ice melted in torrents, and the oceans rose. Sea level climbed more than 100 meters. If you stood on a beach then, the horizon itself would have been moving toward you year after year. Lowlands vanished, coastlines retreated, islands were born and drowned in the span of a few human lifetimes. For those living near the edge of the great ice sheets, in what are now Canada, Northern Europe and Siberia, the change was apocalyptic. Forests shifted north, animals migrated and vanished. The great mammoths, mastodons and saber-toothed cats disappeared forever. The people who hunted them followed the retreating herds, always running from the melt. Further south, in the fertile valleys of the Near East and along the Nile, climate change brought different chaos. Seasonal rains failed, then returned with vengeance. Rivers changed course, carving new deltas and abandoning old ones. Villages that had stood for generations were swept away by storms no one could predict. When the sky itself became uncertain, people turned their fear into stories. Those stories of gods angry, of mountains sinking, of one family saved, spread faster than the floods themselves. 1,000 years later they would be written as myth, but they began as memory. Modern satellites let us see the aftermath from above. The outlines of those vanished worlds lie just beneath the sea, riverbeds curling across continental shelves, mountain ranges ending abruptly beneath blue. Between Britain and Denmark lies Doggerland, once a wide plain of forests and rivers where mammoth and man walked together. When the North Sea rose, it disappeared in silence, leaving only a few flint tools in fishermen's nets to prove it ever existed. Every culture on earth has its Doggerland, a place remembered by no one yet mourned by everyone. The Great Melt did more than redraw maps. It rewired the planet's climate. As oceans expanded, they altered winds, currents, and the heartbeat of the monsoon. Where water had been locked in ice, new energy now pulsed through the atmosphere. Storms grew stronger, seasons less predictable. For the first farmers, trying to tame wild grain in the river valleys of the Fertile Crescent, stability was everything. Unstable skies meant hunger. Hunger demanded faith. Perhaps that is why the earliest temples we know, the stone rings at Göbekli Tepe, built nearly 12,000 years ago, rise exactly at the moment the floods receded. They are the architecture of relief, monuments to survival. In their carvings of animals and celestial signs, some researchers see the first attempt to record not gods but disasters, the catalogue of a world nearly lost to water. When we look back now, it seems inevitable that the people of that age would create a story to contain the memory. The science of glaciation gives numbers, the story gives meaning. One describes cubic kilometers of meltwater, the other asks why it happened and why a few were spared. Between the two lies everything that makes us human. In caves high above vanished lakes, archaeologists find soot from fires that burned just before the floods reached those altitudes. People had climbed to safety, waited, and watched their world drown beneath them. When the waters finally stilled, they carved marks into the rock, simple circles, waves, spirals. The earliest calendars may have begun as attempts to predict when the rain would return. What we call prehistory is filled with these quiet witnesses, a child's footprint preserved beside that of a wolf in drying mud, a line of stones marking where a shore once stood, pollen frozen in peat from forests that no longer exist. Each is a word in the same sentence, written across continents, the sentence that ends, always, in water. To the earth, the floods were merely transition, part of the breathing of climate. To humanity, they were revelation. The age of ice ended, the age of memory began. Out of survival came myth, and from myth, the seed of civilization. When the glaciers retreated, humanity followed the water. At first the migrations were small, families crossing valleys newly freed of ice, hunters tracing the paths of deer into open plains. But as the oceans crept higher, whole peoples began to move. They drifted along shorelines that changed with every generation, building homes where the tides had not yet reached, and leaving them again when the sea reclaimed the sand. Step by step, the world repopulated itself, yet no one ever forgot that the sea could rise. Archaeologists call this the Holocene transition. In truth, it was a global exodus. Rivers became highways, mountains became borders. The map of early civilization emerged not from conquest, but from retreat. From the long, slow search for ground that would not drown. Everywhere the travellers went, they carried with them fragments of the same memory. In new valleys they built shrines to water, carved spirals and waves into stone, sang of storms to their children. The myth of the flood became portable, stitched into language itself. Words for life, breath, and sea often share the same root in ancient tongues. The sound of water became the sound of existence. By 10,000 years ago, the warmth had stabilized enough for the first fields to appear. Along the Tigris, the Nile, the Indus, and the Yellow River, people learned that the same floods which once destroyed could also renew. They built canals and terraces to tame the annual pulse of water, turning destruction into fertility. In those fertile intervals, humanity discovered agriculture, and with it, time. Calendars followed, then writing, and finally history. It is no coincidence that every cradle of civilization rose beside a river that still carried the echo of a vanished sea. The New World was not without reminders. From China to Peru, sudden deluges continued to strike. Volcanic winters dimmed the sun, and glaciers still lingered in mountain shadows. Each catastrophe refreshed the old story, proving that the gods, or the planet, could still change their mind. When priests looked to the sky for omens, they were not seeking myth. They were trying to read the weather. In the floodplains of Mesopotamia, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates wandered unpredictably across their beds, sometimes merging, sometimes abandoning entire cities. The people built levees of clay and prayed for stability. When those levees broke, as they often did, it felt like the world was ending again. So the scribes recorded the event in language that would outlive the mud, the wrath of heaven, the tears of the gods, the cleansing of sin. Geology and morality fused into one enduring metaphor. Far to the west, along the Nile, the yearly inundation became predictable enough to be worshipped. Each summer, when the brown water rose, the Egyptians said the tears of Isis were filling the land. In truth, it was the monsoon's rhythm, another heartbeat left over from the Ice Age. What earlier, generations had feared as destruction became the calendar by which empire was built. Flood had turned from punishment to promise. The same transformation happened again and again. Where the sea had taken, it also gave. Salt flats became ports. Drowned valleys became fertile estuaries rich with fish and silt. Humanity learned to read the tide as language rather than threat, and yet beneath the gratitude an unease remained. The memory of the great melt was still alive, buried like a fossil under layers of ritual and song. Every generation inherited both sides of the lesson. The flood nourishes, and the flood forgets mercy. In South Asia, monsoon rains could erase an entire season's harvest overnight. Ancient chronicles from the Indus cities speak of sudden abandonment, streets filled with mud, houses left half rebuilt. In China, emperors were measured by their ability to control water. A ruler who failed to contain a flood lost not only his fields but his mandate from heaven. Power itself became tied to the mastery of rivers. The echo of Noah's craft turned into government. Even across the ocean, on islands that the first settlers reached by canoe, the memory surfaced again. In Polynesian lore, the sea is alive, a restless ancestor who swells with anger and withdraws in forgiveness. When coral atolls vanish beneath storms, the people say the sea is taking back what it once lent. No one calls it myth. It is a relationship renewed by every wave. To a modern eye, these parallels seem astonishing. How could cultures separated by oceans and millennia share the same metaphors, the same respect, the same fear? Perhaps because they all lived on the same unstable planet. Climate may be the oldest author of religion. Today, scientists reconstruct that ancient age in numbers and graphs, but the story they tell is strangely familiar. Ice cores show sudden spikes of greenhouse gases. Sediment layers mark drought followed by flood. Computer models reveal that the transitions between warm and cold can be abrupt, so abrupt that within a human lifetime whole ecosystems vanish. What myth calls divine punishment, science calls feedback loop. The meaning is the same. The earth responds. If we could travel back to that borderland between ice and warmth, we would find a world half remembered, half new. The seas glimmer higher than before, their surfaces littered with the trunks of drowned forests. Animals crowd onto shrinking islands. Humans gather driftwood, build rafts, and push out onto the unknown. Every voyage across open water begins with desperation and ends in discovery. In this way, the flood that once threatened humanity also taught it to cross the oceans. Necessity turned to curiosity. Fear turned to navigation. The sailors who first glimpsed new horizons were the descendants of those who had fled the rain. Over thousands of years, the floods became less frequent, but the story remained. It hardened into scripture, softened into lullaby, echoed in philosophy. Even the earliest philosophers, Anaximander in Greece, Lao Tzu in China, spoke of cycles of water and renewal as though remembering something they had never seen. The flood had become an idea. The world remakes itself, and survival belongs to those who adapt. By the time empires rose, the physical memory was fading, but the moral one endured. The Ark changed shape. It became a temple, a covenant, a library of knowledge preserved against forgetting. In each age it reappeared under new names, but the blueprint was identical. Build something that floats above chaos. That is what civilization itself is. When historians today trace the birth of writing, mathematics and law, they find them clustered in floodplains. Perhaps it was not coincidence. Perhaps the constant nearness of disaster sharpened the human need to measure, to plan, to record. To live beside a river that might betray you is to learn to read signs. To live after a deluge is to invent history. And so, Long after the ice had melted and the seas found their new boundaries, humanity continued to live as if the waters might return. Dikes in Holland, levees on the Mississippi, seawalls rising around island nations, all are descendants of a fear older than language. We are still building arks, only larger and made of stone and steel. Each is a quiet confession that the story was never only about the past. The age of floods never truly ended. It merely changed tempo, waiting for another pulse of warmth, another shift in the sun, another mistake in our balance with nature. And when it comes, as it surely will, we will tell ourselves the same comforting story, that we saw it coming, that we can survive, that somewhere there will be an ark waiting. For now the sea is calm, and we call this peace. But deep below the waves lie forests still upright, their roots gripping soil that once felt sunlight. Each tree is a monument to the moment when the ice melted and the world began again. We walk upon the aftermath without noticing, and the water waits, patient as ever. When people first began to speak of saving life from water, the vessel already existed in imagination. The ark was never born from wood. It was carved from fear. Yet fear alone does not design blueprints. Something older guided the hands that drew its shape. Archaeologists tracing the earliest flood myths notice a curious detail. Each describes not merely survival, but construction. Someone is warned, someone measures, someone builds. In that sequence of verbs lies the seed of civilization. The moment instinct became engineering. To build against the future is to admit that the world can change. In the low plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates drifted through swamps of reeds, people learned early that water gives and water takes. The flood there was not legend but yearly visitor. Each spring it left behind black silt, thick as smoke, and when it came too high, it erased the work of months. The ark to them was not a miracle, it was logic. A reed boat sealed with pitch, scaled up to carry the memory of an entire tribe. To later poets this became the craft of a chosen man, but to those who watched the river rise, it was the only sensible idea anyone ever had. Further east in the Indus Valley, the same understanding appeared in different material. Wood was scarce, clay abundant. Their flood heroes built barges of baked brick and bitumen, heavy and square, designed not to travel but to float until the storm was done. Even now, fragments of ancient wharves sleep beneath layers of mud older than history itself. They were not the work of a single visionary. They were the collective ark of a people who refused to drown. As the centuries unfolded, the vessel began to change shape in the human mind. It ceased to be a tool and became a covenant. The boat that once carried animals across rising water became a symbol of something larger, the idea that life is worth preserving. In this shift, the flood transformed from disaster into test. Survival itself became proof of favour, and favour became faith. Every retelling refined the design. In Sumer, the ark was a cube, perfect in symmetry, echoing the geometry of their temples. In Babylon, it became round like a coracle, able to spin freely, indifferent to direction. In Hebrew memory, it stretched long like a ship, partitioned for order, its measurements written in cubits precise enough for a carpenter. To each culture, the ark mirrored its sense of the divine, perfection, adaptability, or discipline. What mattered was not its shape, but its endurance. When modern engineers model these dimensions, they find a strange truth. Most of them would have worked. A wooden hull built to those ratios could float stably in turbulent water, though it could not steer. It was a house adrift, a deliberate surrender to fate. Perhaps that is the most human design of all, the architecture of waiting. As flood myths spread, the Ark gathered passengers from every belief. In the highlands of Anatolia, shepherds told of rafts made from the hides of oxen. Along the Nile, fishermen spoke of boats carrying sacred animals to higher ground during the inundation. Among the Greeks, Deucalion and Pyrrha built their chest of salvation. Among the Norse, Lith and Lifthrasir sheltered within Yggdrasil as fire and water remade the world. Different continents, different tongues, the same blueprint repeated. Scholars once dismissed these parallels as coincidence. Yet coincidence repeated across hemispheres begins to look like memory. If the Great Flood was truly global in its reach, even if in fragments, it would have seeded identical instincts everywhere. Gather what matters, keep it above the water, wait. That instinct, not divine intervention, may be the real miracle. The earliest art seems to remember it. On rock faces in the Caucasus, simple carvings show boats lifted by waves beneath a disk of sun. In caves along the Mediterranean coast, charcoal drawings depict rows of animals facing the same direction, as if marching onto an unseen platform. To the untrained eye they are decorations. To the anthropologist they are field notes written in symbol. When the world broke apart, people recorded what they saw in the only archive available, the walls around them. The notion of gathering life 2 by 2 may sound poetic, but biologists reading those texts see something remarkable. The numbers roughly match the minimum breeding pairs required to preserve a species. It is possible that through trial and loss, ancient farmers learned that pattern and passed it into myth. In the story, every creature survives. In the field, a few were enough to begin again. The Ark, then, is both metaphor and memory. It represents the first understanding of ecosystem, the awareness that survival is collective. In saving the animals, the builders were also saving themselves. Civilization would one day call this ecology, but its roots lie in panic and compassion intertwined. By the time writing stabilized into alphabets, the flood stories had already drifted across languages. Scribes copied them onto clay, papyrus, bark and stone, carrying the same equation into every new world. Water plus time equals rebirth. Each copy blurred the technical into the sacred. Measurements became metaphors, instructions became laws. A design that once described timber and pitch evolved into the architecture of faith. And yet, beneath all that reverence, a practical question remains. Where did the builders learn to imagine a vessel so vast? What memory of storms or rising seas taught them that buoyancy could mean salvation? Did they witness a real event so terrifying that its details were carved into humanity's collective instinct? Or did the Ark precede the flood, born of some earlier trial now lost to erosion? The earth keeps few secrets, but the ones it keeps are buried deep, in mud, in myth, in the silence between both. If the Ark ever existed as wooden rope, time has reclaimed it. But as idea and warning it never sank. It sails still across our literature, our science and our dreams, reminding us that the water always comes back. To understand the Ark, we must return to the people who imagined it. 12,000 years ago, the planet was still trembling from the last convulsions of the Ice Age. The equator steamed, the poles wept, and between them stretched a mosaic of half-frozen valleys and new grasslands. It was not yet the world we know. It was an unfinished painting, wet and changing under the brush of climate. Across the Fertile Crescent, clusters of hunter-gatherers began to linger in one place. They followed the slow rhythm of the rivers, planting wild barley, shaping the first clay jars, building the first walls that would stand through a season of rain. Their camps lay on the shoulders of the Tigris, on the banks of the Euphrates, and in the shadow of hills that caught the scent of the sea. In those fertile basins the flood was both neighbour and enemy. When the waters behaved, they left behind life. When they forgot their path, they erased it. The earliest builders lived within that contradiction. They learned that survival meant predicting water. They read the colour of clouds as language, the cry of birds as warning, the tilt of reeds as measurement. 1,000 generations before written numbers, they were already engineers of intuition. Each hut of woven reed, each clay embankment, each storage pit was a small experiment in balance. The world they knew was smaller than ours, but richer in immediacy. The sky was not an abstraction. It was a ceiling that sometimes leaked. The earth was alive and its moods had names. To them the flood was not merely weather, it was personality. When the rains came early, it was an argument. When the river refused to rise, it was neglect. Their stories were diplomacy with nature. Among these early peoples, certain individuals became interpreters of that diplomacy. They were neither kings nor priests, because kings and priests did not yet exist. They were memory keepers, men and women who could recall the last time the sea came too close. When they spoke of a boat built to ride out the wrath of the heavens, they were not predicting. They were remembering. Every retelling carried instructions disguised as reverence. Gather food, bind wood, seal with pitch, wait for the wind to change. Archaeological layers tell us that by 9000 BC, settlements were already appearing on higher ground, deliberately placed above floodplains. Some of these villages, Jericho, Abu Huraira, Chayonu, show evidence of sudden rebuilding, as if washed clean and raised again. Beneath their floors lie deposits of fine river clay where no river flows today. Each layer of silt is a diary entry written by water. It says, "We came this far once, and we will come again." The builders adapted. They invented drainage channels and stone foundations. They shaped walls that curved inward like hulls, deflecting pressure rather than resisting it. Even their temples echoed the geometry of boats. Long, narrow halls pointed toward imagined horizons. From these, design habits the myth of a vessel large enough for the world could easily grow. The Ark was simply the house of the gods scaled up to fit humanity itself. Trade spread along the same rivers that threatened them. Bitumen from the shores of the Persian Gulf travelled north to seal boats. Obsidian from Anatolia travelled south to make blades. Knowledge floated with it. Every exchange carried stories of storms, of harvests lost, of a mountain that once became an island. In this way, technology and mythology moved together like twin currents. We know from surviving fragments that these early cultures understood more than chance should allow. They could align monuments with solstices, chart the return of certain stars, predict seasonal floods within days. To modernize, this looks mystical. In truth, it was statistical memory preserved through ritual. They watched the heavens because the heavens controlled the rain. Imagine one of their cities just before the deluge. a dense cluster of mud brick homes surrounded by canals. Children chase goats through narrow alleys, potters fire clay in open kilns, fishermen mend nets of twisted flax. The air smells of smoke and sweet rot. Far upstream, the mountains are already melting under sudden heat. Within days, the calm canals turn brown. Within weeks, the brown becomes sound, thunder underfoot. The elders remember the stories. They begin to build. Perhaps that moment is the origin of every ark, the day when observation met faith. They knew the water was coming because they could see it. They believed survival was possible because someone once had. Centuries later, when the floods were retold as punishment and deliverance, the technical became sacred. Measurements became commandments. Materials became holy. Pitch and timber were no longer commodities. They were sacraments against chaos. To question the blueprint was to risk drowning twice, once in water and once in doubt. Outside Mesopotamia, similar transformations occurred. In the hills of the Caucasus, communities built circular stone enclosures that could withstand storms rolling down from glaciers. In India, builders mastered baked brick platforms lifted above the monsoon line. In China, early Neolithic farmers diverted rivers into controlled basins, miniature models of the ark turned inside out, holding the water rather than escaping it. Everywhere the same logic emerged. If you cannot stop the flood, you can shape it. This age of builders left few monuments of stone but an abundance of design. The boat, the dam, the terrace, the granary, all were extensions of the same idea: storage of life. To the modern scientist, they are the first infrastructures. To the storyteller, they are metaphors for hope. That dual meaning has survived longer than any wall. Even language remembers it. The Sumerian word for boat, ma, is also the root of mother. The Akkadian term for ark, elepu, carries the sense of enclosure and womb. In Hebrew, Tiba means both the vessel of Noah and the basket that carried the infant Moses down the Nile. Every tongue repeats the same subconscious equation: to float is to be born again. Over time, the builders themselves vanished, absorbed into empires whose scribes wrote on tablets instead of mud. But the myths they left behind grew with the civilizations that inherited them. Kings claimed descent from the flood survivors. Priests traced rituals back to the ship's landing. When conquerors crossed deserts, they said they were following the path of the ark to new mountains. What began as a manual for endurance became the foundation of legitimacy. Today, when archaeologists sift through the ruins of those first cities, they find the echoes of practical minds rather than prophets. Each layer of habitation shows improvement: a wall higher than the last, a canal straighter, a granary built farther from the shore. Progress written in mud. The ark was not an anomaly, but the culmination of 10,000 small inventions driven by necessity. In that sense, every engineer is still building it. If a historian were to summarize the builder's world in one sentence, it might read, "They lived between the flood and the memory of the flood." That narrow interval, filled with vigilance and gratitude, gave birth to architecture, mathematics, and myth. It taught humanity to imagine safety before danger arrived. The world they built is long gone, drowned, eroded, or dusted with salt, yet its outline persists in our cities raised along river mouths, in the levees that guard our harbours, in the satellites that track tomorrow's storms. We are their descendants not in blood but in precaution. They handed down the oldest profession of all, builder against water. When the storytellers of later ages spoke of a man chosen to save creation, they were honouring that inheritance. The Ark was not just a miracle of survival, it was the first design born from foresight. The people who imagined it did not wait for rescue, they constructed it. Their courage was quiet, their tools simple, their wisdom vast. And so, as we stand on higher ground today, watching our own seas rise inch by inch, the story of the builders returns with new relevance. We recognize in their fear the reflection of our own, and in their labour the outline of our future. Every dam, every wall, every emergency plan is a whisper from that ancient world, reminding us that foresight is faith made practical. For thousands of years, the story of the flood drifted through temples, churches, and libraries as myth. Then, in an age that trusted measurement more than memory, people began to ask a new question. If the story is legend, why does the earth remember it too? The 19th century was the moment when curiosity turned into expedition. Scholars had translated the cuneiform tablets of Nineveh and found within them a flood narrative older than Genesis. Suddenly the Ark no longer belonged only to faith, it belonged to history. Newspapers printed sketches of the ancient hero Utnapishtim. Museums displayed the fragments of clay like relics. The boundary between archaeology and scripture blurred under the same light. The explorers of that era were part scientist, part pilgrim. They carried hammers and compasses, but also reverence. Each valley of Mesopotamia was, to them, a possible birthplace of the deluge. When the uncovered river-borne sediments far above any modern floodplain, they felt they were touching the edge of the impossible. A single layer of clay, uniform across hundreds of miles, seemed to whisper confirmation. The waters had once ruled here. Yet evidence is never simple. The strata dated to different centuries. Each flood was local. Still, the idea of a single global event refused to die. Every new discovery, every ruined wall buried under sand, every shell lifted from a mountain was folded into the larger narrative. The search for Noah's Ark had become a mirror of humanity's oldest habit, the need to prove that belief can leave fossils. In the early 20th century, the mountains of Ararat rose to mythic prominence. The book of Genesis had placed the Ark upon the mountains of Ararat, plural, a vague geography somewhere in the Armenian highlands. Adventurers, missionaries, and later soldiers crossing the region claimed to see strange shapes within the glaciers, dark ridges that curved like the ribs of a ship, or beams protruding from ice. No photograph ever settled the matter, yet the sightings multiplied. During the Second World War, a Russian pilot flying over the peak reported an enormous wooden structure embedded in snow at 14,000 feet. He marked the coordinates, but war erased paperwork faster than snow melts. When later researchers searched for his report, it had vanished into bureaucracy. What remained was the story and the magnetism of the mountain itself. Mount Ararat is beautiful in the way that warnings are beautiful, symmetrical, silent, and crowned with ice. Every summer its glaciers crack, exposing rock. Every winter they heal. For those who climb it, time feels circular, as if the mountain reenacts the flood endlessly, freezing and thawing, hiding and revealing. It is easy to believe that something ancient sleeps beneath that rhythm. By the mid-1900s, technology joined faith. Aerial photography offered a new vantage point. Planes traced patterns across the snow, seeking symmetry in chaos. Later, satellites sharpened the view. Images revealed an anomaly, a long boat-shaped ridge on a nearby slope called Drupinar. It measured roughly 500 feet, close to the length described in the biblical text. Excavations followed. Soil samples were tested, timbers rumoured, artefacts announced. Each claim rose like the mountain's own mirage, shimmering, half true. Laboratories found no clear organic carbon, yet believers pointed to metallic grid lines in the ground and said the wood had turned to stone. Skeptics called it geology, a natural fold of mudstone shaped by erosion. Both sides stared at the same photographs and saw their own reflections. Meanwhile, other researchers turned away from mountains to the sea. If the flood was real, they reasoned, its evidence must lie underwater. Oceanographers began to map continental shelves, revealing drowned landscapes, ancient river channels carved into the seabed, terraces that could only have been shorelines. Each new sonar image was a ghost map of a world that once breathed air. Off the coast of India, divers found masonry blocks scattered beneath silt near the Gulf of Khumbat. Off Japan's Yonaguni coast, stair-like structures hinted at forgotten architects. In the Black Sea, marine geologists discovered a sharp line in the sediment where freshwater mollusks gave way to saltwater species, the precise moment, some believed, when the sea had poured in from the Mediterranean and swallowed the villages on its shore. The evidence is fragmented, yet the pattern persists. Wherever humans once lived at sea level, the ocean now conceals their ruins. The flood may not have been a single event, but 1,000 local drownings stitched together by story into one global memory. For the scientists who search these depths, the work demands both rigour and humility. They know that nature can imitate design. Basalt columns can mimic walls, coral can sculpt steps, wind and tide can draw perfect geometry by accident. Yet, time and again, they return to the field. Something in the human mind resists coincidence when faced with symmetry in stone. Above the waters, the same impulse drives climbers back to Ararat, to the peaks of Judi Daj, to the frozen ranges of Iran and Armenia. Each expedition repeats the old narrative in miniature: preparation, voyage, uncertainty, revelation, doubt. Some bring radar scanners and drones, others bring prayer. All return with photographs and questions. The Ark, whatever it was, remains elusive, perhaps not because it is hidden, but because it was never one thing to begin with. Modern archaeology has a phrase for such phenomena: cultural convergence. When many societies face the same problem, they often arrive at the same solution independently. Flood recurs, a boat appears, the survivors tell their children, the pattern endures. The Ark may thus be less a singular artifact than a universal design, reborn wherever water threatened. Even in the absence of wood or nails, the search has yielded something valuable. Core samples, sonar maps, ice sheet records, all confirm that the period between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago was punctuated by catastrophic floods on a planetary scale. Every legend, every hymn of rebirth, fits neatly within that window. Science, in its own cautious language, now echoes what the storyteller said first: the world once drowned. For the explorers who spend their lives on this question, that is enough. They are not merely chasing a boat, they are tracing the boundary between memory and geology. Each shard of pottery lifted from silt, Each fossilized ripple in stone is a verse of the same ancient hymn. And whether the Ark rests on a mountaintop or never existed at all, the pursuit has already proved the deeper truth. That myth is often the language of data remembered by heart. As the 21st century deepens, satellites scan the Earth with radar that can penetrate snow and soil. Each new map brings sharper detail and the same conclusion. The landscape is full of absences. There are cities we cannot see, rivers that no longer flow, and beneath every ocean a museum without doors. The flood is not behind us, it is beneath us. Yet still the search continues, not because we expect to find a ship, but because looking for it reminds us of what it meant. The Ark stands for the moment when humanity realized that knowledge could be a form of shelter. Each generation builds its own version, sometimes from wood, sometimes from steel, sometimes from equations predicting the next storm. The explorers of today climb and dive for the same reason the first builders gathered timber, hope disguised as curiosity. They are heirs to a question older than faith. Can we preserve what we love when the water rises again? In seeking the Ark, they are really seeking reassurance that the answer is still yes. If the story of the flood began with water, it is fitting that the answers now sleep there. Beneath the calm surface of modern seas lies a second world, one that once saw daylight, felt wind, heard the footsteps of its builders. What we call ocean floor was, in another age, meadow and forest, city and plain. Every continental shelf is a photograph of a vanished coastline, its frame measured in miles of salt and silence. When sonar pulses sweep those shelves, they return with shadows. Some are gentle slopes, others hard geometry, lines and corners that should not exist in nature. To the cautious eye, they are simply anomalies. To the hopeful, they are ruins waiting for air. The machines cannot decide which is true, so they send both possibilities upward through cables, leaving interpretation to human imagination. In the eastern Mediterranean, a few hundred meters below the blue, lie the remains of pavements and walls near the island of Crete. Divers found them half buried in silt, cut from limestone, arranged in patterns that suggest order rather than chance. Sediment dating places them at roughly 9,000 years before the present, exactly the time when the sea first invaded the Aegean basins. If people once lived there, their cities drowned before history learned to write their names. Farther east, along the coasts of Lebanon and Israel, archaeologists have mapped harbours long forgotten, their quays still visible beneath clear water. Phoenician engineers built them in the Bronze Age, but below those lie deeper structures, breakwaters formed from stone blocks older than any known civilization in the region. Each new discovery lowers the floor of the human timeline a little further, pushing the dawn of architecture toward the shadow of the flood. Off the Indian subcontinent, the Gulf of Kambat hides one of the most debated sites of all. In 2001, sonar scans revealed symmetrical patterns stretching for miles across the seabed, grids and rectangles that looked uncannily like streets. The currents there are fierce, visibility is poor, and no diver can stay long. Still, a handful of artifacts were brought to the surface, shaped stones, a fragment of pottery, a single human tooth. Dating tests gave conflicting ages, some modern, some 12,000 years old. The debate endures, but one fact is certain. The Gulf was once dry land, and when the sea came, it came fast. Similar stories rise from every shore. The North Sea conceals the lost plains of Doggerland, where forests once stretched between England and Europe. In Southeast Asia, beneath the Java Sea, sonar reveals river channels that match those feeding today's Mekong and Chao Phraya. In the Caribbean, divers explore terraces that mirror the shape of ancient harbours now miles inland. Every ocean tells the same quiet story. The world is larger than memory and older than comfort. For geologists, these finds are not surprises but confirmations. They see in them the fingerprints of the last great warming, the meltwater pulse that lifted oceans 100 meters in less than 1,000 years. Each submerged ruin is a single heartbeat of that event, frozen in place. Yet even the most technical minds admit a certain awe. To study drowned landscapes is to read the diary of a planet that writes in tides. Oceanography has turned the myth of the flood from poetry into pattern. Sediment cores reveal repeating cycles, sudden warmth, glacial collapse, sea rise, stabilization, and then another calm. The rhythm is older than humanity and will continue long after us. The flood, in this view, was not punishment but punctuation, the full stop at the end of one chapter of climate before the next began. Still there are traces that feel personal. Wooden stakes from ancient fish traps rise through sand where only waves should move. Stone circles, once observatories of stars, now mark constellations of coral. Occasionally, a pot remains upright, its rim unbroken, a small breathless museum at the bottom of the sea. To find such things is to meet ghosts of ordinary days, evidence that the flood did not erase life, only relocate it. As mapping technology sharpens, more of those ghosts appear. High-resolution sonar now draws images detailed enough to see staircases, courtyards, and causeways beneath sediment. Each discovery challenges the boundary between prehistory and imagination. The myth spoke of golden cities swallowed by the ocean. The scanners answer with grids of data that look much the same. Science cannot confirm Atlantis, yet it quietly admits that half of human history may simply be underwater. For anthropologists, the question is no longer whether the flood happened, but how memory survived it. Oral tradition travels poorly across millennia, yet these stories endured, mutating, localizing, adapting to new languages while keeping their bones intact. They speak of noise, of darkness, of a return to silence. They speak of a few who climbed to high ground and watched the horizon vanish. Somewhere within those verses lies eyewitness testimony older than any artifact. Perhaps this endurance explains our modern obsession with rediscovery. Every submarine, every sonar array, every expedition into the abyss repeats the ancient gesture of looking back at what water took. We are, in a sense, still searching for the shore that vanished. The Ark was one answer to that loss. Sonar and satellites are another. Both are tools built from the same human refusal to let the past stay drowned. In recent decades, oceanographers have begun to translate their findings into sound. They play the echoes of sonar through speakers, chirps and hums that mark stone, coral, void. Listened to without context, they resemble whale song or distant thunder. It is the planet speaking in frequencies our ancestors would have called divine. The sea is not silent, it is simply deep. When the data are assembled, grids, cores, isotope graphs, the picture that emerges is both scientific and strangely emotional. Between 15 and 8,000 years ago, the face of Earth changed more dramatically than in any period since. Mountains lost their glaciers, deserts bloomed, oceans climbed over their banks. Every coast we know today was drawn during that upheaval. If humanity lived through it, no wonder the memory of water became the memory of judgment. The deeper divers go, the clearer the pattern becomes. There is no single ark, no single flood. Only a world learning again and again that nothing stands higher than the sea. In that repetition lies the truth behind the myth. The flood was never about one event. It was about the condition of living on a breathing planet. If myth is memory written in words, geology is memory written in matter. The earth keeps its diary not in ink but in layers. Every grain of sand, every vein of salt, every trapped bubble of air is a sentence describing the world as it once was. High in Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drill through ice that fell as snow before language existed. Each metre of core is a chapter of atmosphere, frozen time. Within it lie dust from distant deserts, pollen from vanished forests, and tiny pockets of ancient air. By measuring the gases inside, carbon dioxide, methane, oxygen, they can watch climate breathe across millennia. Near the layer dated to 12,000 years ago, the ice changes character. Its colour darkens, its crystals grow irregular, trapped bubbles show sudden jumps in greenhouse gases. The planet, it seems, inhaled warmth all at once. Within a few centuries, perhaps within decades, temperatures rose by 7 degrees. Sea levels surged, storms followed. That moment captured in ice is the geological echo of every flood story ever told. In the Canadian Shield, scars called drumlins point the direction of vanished glaciers. They are the frozen wake of rivers made of ice. Between them lie kettle lakes, pockets where blocks of glacier were left behind, melted, and became mirrors of sky. Each basin tells of collapse and retreat, of landscapes remade in a single season. Across Europe, geologists walk through what once were seas. In the limestone cliffs of Malta, they find fossil shells far above the modern shoreline, proof that the island has ridden the ocean's lung, sinking, rising, sinking again. In Sicily, coral growth rings mark ancient shorelines like tally marks on stone. Every mark records a time when the water paused, as if catching its breath before climbing higher. The Himalayas hold another kind of testimony. Embedded within peaks that scrape the clouds are fossils of ammonites, spiral shells from creatures that lived in tropical seas hundreds of millions of years ago. To hold one in your hand is to hold a paradox, a seashell from the roof of the world. It reminds us that mountains themselves were once seabed, and that the earth does not distinguish between ascent and drowning. It moves, folds, exhales, and begins again. Even deserts bear witness. In the Sahara, radar imaging reveals buried riverbeds, the ghost channels of a green Africa that existed when the ice sheets last melted. Where dunes now roll unbroken, crocodile bones and petrified wood lie under the sand. Once there were lakes large enough to rival the Great Lakes of North America. Once there were fish where today only dust drifts. The continent dried as the monsoon retreated, but the shapes of water remain, drawn like veins beneath the skin of sand. In the Pacific Northwest of America, the landscape tells its story in stone of motion. Giant boulders from Canada sit isolated in Oregon fields, carried there by icebergs during the Missoula floods, a series of cataclysms unleashed when a glacial dam broke again and again. Each time it burst, an inland sea drained in hours, scouring canyons and carving ripples taller than houses. To stand among them is to hear, in silence, the roar of water that moved faster than thought. Those floods are the closest physical match science has found to the scale described in legend. They prove that the Earth is capable of deluge vast enough to reset memory itself. And beneath Antarctica's ice, satellites detect rivers still flowing, hidden and warm, cutting channels in darkness. The process that once ended an ice age continues below our feet. The planet has not stopped moving. It merely sleeps between breaths. When researchers lay these records side by side, ice cores, fossils, isotopes, they find that they speak a single language. It is the language of change. It says that the Earth has drowned itself many times and will again. The patterns repeat. Warmth rises, ice melts, oceans expand, life retreats to higher ground. Each cycle writes a new myth, and every myth is a footnote to geology. For the scientist reading data, the story is one of cause and effect. For the dreamer hearing it aloud, it is poetry. Both are true. Because when the first storytellers spoke of God's pouring water upon the world, they were describing in their own vocabulary the same physics that glaciologists now measure with lasers. Faith and science differ in tone, not in wonder. In every rock core, in every frozen bubble, the same quiet sentence repeats. The flood was real, though its cause was not anger, but heat. And from that heat, the world that we know was born. Stone remembers the shape of water, but people remember its sound. For generations, geologists studied the scars of the ancient floods without realizing that those scars ran through us too. In our languages, our migrations, our myths. Each rise in sea level left not only new coastlines, but new chapters of human history. The flood was never just physical. It was cultural, and the proof, like the tide, is everywhere it has ever touched. Archaeologists searching the margins of ancient seas have found a pattern that repeats across continents. As shorelines moved inland, people followed them. They rebuilt their homes again and again, leaving behind layers of pottery and hearth ash that now rest beneath modern beaches. Carbon dating places these ruins at the exact boundary when the last ice age collapsed. The evidence is neither random nor isolated. It forms a global chorus, a record of humanity learning the hard way that the ground beneath our feet is temporary. In the Persian Gulf, sonar imaging reveals the trace of 4 mighty rivers converging into a single delta, a drowned landscape scholars call the Gulf Oasis. Sediment cores show that it was once a vast plain rich in freshwater springs and wild grain. Some researchers believe it could have been the cradle of early civilization, a place where humans first began to settle and plant deliberately. If so, when the sea finally invaded the valley, it did not simply erase villages, it scattered a culture. Those who fled north would have carried their memories with them, the memory of a paradise lost to water. In their descendants' tongues, it became the story of Eden and of a flood that followed. The same echoes surface far away. In the islands of Southeast Asia, the sea rose by as much as 130 meters between 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, submerging entire archipelagos. Linguists have traced common words for boat, storm, and high ground across languages separated by oceans. Those words are older than agriculture, older than metallurgy, and they share a rhythm of survival. When spoken aloud, they sound less like vocabulary and more like inheritance. In Japan, beneath the calm waters near Yonaguni, stone terraces descend like steps into the deep. Some claim they are the remnants of an Ice Age city. Others insist they are natural formations, but nearby, divers have found human tools, chipped stone, traces of fire, within layers of sediment now far below the tide. Whether Yonaguni was city or coincidence, it sits precisely where the sea rose fastest. To the ancestors of Japan's islanders, the ocean itself must have seemed alive, hungry, devouring land each season. Their myths remember dragons beneath the waves, monsters that steal the shore. To a scientist, those dragons are simply the physics of melting ice. But the emotional truth is the same. The world they knew was being eaten. In northern Europe, Doggerland stretched between England and Denmark like a green bridge. It was home to hunters and herders who followed reindeer across open grasslands. Then, around 6200 BC, the sea surged. A massive undersea landslide off Norway, the Storegga Slide, triggered tsunamis that tore through the coastlines. When the waves withdrew, Doggerland was gone. All that remains are fragments, spears dredged from the North Sea, footprints preserved in clay, seeds trapped in peat, and perhaps, though we cannot prove it, a story whispered to frightened children about the day the sea came to life. That story would migrate too, from generation to generation, from tribe to tribe, until it reached the poets of later ages who would call it by other names: Deucalion, Noah, Manu. In the Americas, the pattern reappears with eerie familiarity. The first peoples who crossed from Asia into the new continent would eventually face the same thaw. Glacial lakes in Canada burst their natural dams again and again, flooding entire regions. Tribes along the Pacific Northwest still tell of the day the mountains vomited water, of canoes tied to treetops, of a chosen few who floated for days before the waters fell. For centuries, anthropologists dismissed such tales as metaphor. Then they found the sediments, thick layers of silt deposited miles inland, matching the timing of the floods. Myth, once again, turned out to be eyewitness. Even in Australia, where the Dreamtime stories are among the oldest living oral traditions on Earth, coastal Aboriginal groups speak of the sea swallowing their lands. Their accounts describe headlands that once extended far into the ocean, lagoons where now there is open sea, and islands that used to be connected. Marine geologists comparing those stories to bathymetric maps found a perfect match. The coastlines described by ancient storytellers correspond exactly to those that existed 12,000 years ago. The people had preserved the memory of a flood for more than 400 generations, without writing, without maps, only through voice. When all these fragments are laid side by side, Doggerland, the Gulf Oasis, Yonaguni, the Pacific Northwest, the Dreamtime coasts, a larger picture appears. The flood was not one story copied across continents. It was one experience retold in every language. Each culture carried a piece of the same event, seen from a different shore. In laboratories today, computers model those ancient transformations. Digital reconstructions show continents shrinking as oceans fill, islands breaking into chains, and river valleys vanishing beneath waves of blue. To watch it unfold is to witness myth in motion. The images show not a single deluge, but 1,000 simultaneous ones, the global pulse of a planet adjusting to warmth. For the first time in history, science and story overlap perfectly. Both agree that there was a flood and that we were there to see it. Even human genetics remembers. When researchers map the migration of mitochondrial DNA, they find population bottlenecks. points where numbers dropped dramatically before expanding again. Some coincide with known climate disasters, including the Great Melt. The survivors became the ancestors of us all. Our bloodline itself carries the proof of a near extinction. We are, every one of us, descendants of those who found the high ground in time. To scientists, this data is elegant. To storytellers, it is profound. The Ark may never be found because it was never singular. It was humanity itself, scattered, frightened, adapting, carrying life forward. Each tribe, each village, built its own version. Together, they were the fleet of survival. Even the Bible, read carefully, admits plurality. The mountains of Ararat, not one, but many. Perhaps the Ark rests on every ridge where people once waited for the rain to stop. Perhaps every mountain that held survivors is sacred because it was a kind of Ark itself. As the evidence accumulates, one realization becomes impossible to ignore. The flood was not the end of the world. It was the beginning of memory. The moment when nature reminded humanity that permanence is an illusion. When the waters fell, they left behind not just new soil, but a new kind of creature. One who could look backward and say, "We endured." That ability to remember, to turn survival into story, is our greatest invention. Long before writing, before fire's mastery or the wheel's simplicity, we discovered meaning. And meaning, unlike wood or stone, does not decay. When you hold a piece of fossilized coral in your hand, or stand atop a mountain that was once seabed, you are standing inside that memory. The world speaks, softly but clearly. I have been drowned and reborn. So have you. And in that shared confession, science and scripture finally agree. The story had been reborn in science, confirmed in stone and echoed in myth. But for some, that was not enough. They wanted wood. They wanted the Ark. The mountain most associated with the legend stands over the high plains of eastern Turkey, Mount Ararat, the frozen monument where, according to scripture, the Ark came to rest when the waters fell. It rises alone, white-crowned and solemn, visible for 100 miles in every direction. For centuries it has drawn explorers the way a candle draws a moth, not to illuminate truth, but to touch mystery. The first formal expedition dates back to the 1820s, when a German naturalist named Friedrich Parrot climbed its slopes with Armenian guides. He found no ship, but the view from the summit convinced him that if a vessel ever did land here, it would have nowhere else to go. The mountain stands like a punctuation mark at the edge of the world, the last high refuge between floodplain and sky. In the following century, travellers returned again and again. Locals spoke of dark shapes emerging from the ice in late summer, of wooden beams half buried in glacial melt. Stories blurred into sightings, sightings into claims. Each new generation added another layer to the legend. Explorers who vanished, maps with missing coordinates, secret photos tucked away in archives that no one could find again. It was less an investigation than a pilgrimage of doubt. Then, in 1916, during the First World War, a Russian aviator flying over Ararat reported seeing what looked like a massive wooden structure embedded in ice. He drew its outline and claimed it matched the biblical dimensions. His report was sent to St. Petersburg and promptly disappeared amid revolution. The coordinates were lost. What remained was the rumour, passed from one adventurer to the next like a sacred heirloom. After the war, the search resumed. Missionaries, Archaeologists, treasure hunters, and soldiers all made attempts. Some returned with photographs of odd formations in the snow, long, symmetrical, unlike the jagged terrain around them. Others brought fragments of dark wood said to have been found high above the tree line. Tests yielded confusing results. Some pieces were modern, others so old they could not be dated. And so, paradoxically, uncertainty became proof. If the Ark refused verification, perhaps it was because it was meant to. In the 1950s, aerial photography revealed something new. On a slope 16 miles from Ararat's main peak, explorers spotted a boat-shaped depression roughly 500 feet long, almost identical to the measurements given in Genesis. It became known as the Durupinar Formation. Excavations followed. Ground-penetrating radar detected linear patterns beneath the soil, which believers claimed were the remains of ribs and decks. Skeptics countered that it was merely a natural fold of mudstone hardened by pressure. The debate hardened too. Even now, half a century later, it remains, unresolved. A geological Rorschach test where faith sees timber and science sees clay. Mount Ararat itself hides no fewer than 5 supposed Ark sites, each claimed by a different expedition. Some lie within glaciers, others in crevasses too dangerous to reach. From time to time, satellite images reignite interest. Strange, regular shapes appear after thaws, then vanish when snow returns. Each discovery spawns documentaries, books, arguments, and new maps with slightly different red circles. In this way, the Ark has become a perpetual mirage, materializing whenever technology advances just enough to make hope believable again. But beneath the hype lies genuine research. Glaciologists studying Ararat's slopes have confirmed that melting patterns could easily reveal, and then quickly conceal, large objects trapped in ice. Geologists note that massive floods from glacial lakes once roared through this region, consistent with the timeline of ancient deluges. Even if no ship rests there, the mountain itself bears witness to the kind of catastrophe that could have birthed the myth. In recent decades, new tools have joined the quest. Drones scan crevasses once unreachable. Satellites read thermal signatures beneath snow. 3D mapping renders every contour of the mountain in exquisite detail. Still, the ice keeps its secret. Sometimes it offers hints, a dark ridge, a hollow echo, only to erase them by the next storm. Ararat remains patient, indifferent to curiosity, a mountain that knows the power of ambiguity. Yet the search extends far beyond Turkey. Other peaks have been proposed, Mount Judi in southeastern Turkey, favoured by early Islamic tradition, Mount Kardu in Iran, Mount Kudi near the Tigris. Each has yielded artefacts, fragments of ancient ship planks, bitumen, tools. Each has its defenders and detractors. The story seems to migrate like the flood itself, always flowing toward new ground. Why does the search endure? After 2 centuries of expeditions, no definitive evidence has emerged. No hull, no inscription, no preserved structure large enough to match the myth. Still, people climb. They climb because the Ark represents something larger than archaeology. It is the symbol of survival written into the DNA of civilization, a promise that catastrophe can be endured. To find it would be to hold proof that humanity has always been capable of rebuilding. For the scientists who have joined these missions, the motivation is subtler. They are drawn not by faith, but by the hope of understanding how myth crystallizes around geography. If one could locate the exact mountain that inspired the earlier storytellers, It might reveal how memory becomes sacred. Was the Ark placed on Ararat because survivors really climbed there? Or did the mountain become holy because people needed a visible anchor for an invisible past? In seeking the object, we are really seeking the origin of belief itself. The more evidence accumulates, the clearer the paradox becomes. The Ark may never have existed, yet its absence keeps the story alive. Had explorers found a ship perfectly preserved in ice, the legend would have ended in a museum. Instead, it continues to breathe, reshaping itself with every generation. What began as a vessel has become a mirror, reflecting our desire to know that someone, somewhere, once made it through the storm. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the real Ark is not wood or pitch or measurement, but the idea of preservation that has guided every act of civilization since. The libraries we build, the data we archive, the seeds we store in vaults beneath the Arctic. Each is a new Ark, carrying life through a flood of different kind. The myth never ended. It evolved. At the base of Mount Ararat there is a small village where shepherds still tell travellers that in certain summers, when the ice retreats just right, they can see the outline of a great ship high above the clouds. When asked if they believe it is real, they smile and answer, "Real enough." For them, proof is not necessary. The mountain is enough. It stands as witness to both faith and flood, enduring, half-hidden, exactly as the story demands. Each generation believes it is more rational than the last, yet the search for the Ark never stops. It moves from parchment to telescope, from myth to model, from prayer to 3D scan, a pilgrimage upgraded with better equipment. Documentaries promise revelations. Satellite photos circulate online. Computer-generated ships rise from ice on glowing screens. For a brief moment the world looks upward, imagining that the oldest story might still yield new proof. And when the excitement fades, the silence of the mountain returns, unchanged. The pattern is familiar, rhythmic, discovery, doubt, rediscovery, like the pulse of the tide itself. Why does the story keep returning? Why does the idea of a single vessel built to survive the end of the world continue to feel relevant in an age that can explain every thunderstorm? Part of the answer is simple. The flood never really ended. Sea levels still rise, storms still come, and our news feeds carry new versions of the same fear. Drowned cities, vanished coasts, displaced families. Each headline is a verse in the same ancient psalm. We may have satellites and weather models, but emotionally, we still live beside an unpredictable sea. When we imagine the Ark, we are imagining rescue. In the 20th century, the Ark re-entered popular consciousness not through scripture, but through cinema. Black and white adventure reels turned explorers into heroes. Colour documentaries turned skepticism into suspense. Later came digital epics, computer-generated floods crashing over cities, humanity rebuilding in steel instead of wood. The imagery changes, but the emotional geometry remains. Catastrophe, cleansing, renewal. Our fascination is less with the disaster than with the continuity afterward. Psychologists studying myth call this the salvage archetype, the narrative pattern in which destruction becomes a doorway to rebirth. It appears everywhere, in Gilgamesh, in Atlantis, in modern apocalypses. The Ark is simply the purest form of it, the moment before the new world begins. To dream of the Ark is to dream that we will be chosen to carry something forward when everything else is lost. the modern world has its own arks, though we rarely name them as such. The seed vault buried in Svalbard's permafrost, holding millions of species of grain. Data archives sealed in mountain bunkers to preserve the internet against catastrophe. Cryogenic banks storing DNA, genomes, even the voices of extinct animals. Each of these projects was designed by engineers, funded by governments, executed by scientists, yet their logic is identical to the builders of old. Protect life, prepare for the flood. We are repeating the story in code and concrete. Climate science, too, has given the myth new context. Rising oceans, melting glaciers, storms that grow stronger each year. The headlines echo the same anxiety our ancestors carved into tablets. When people speak of climate resilience, they are, in a sense, speaking of arks, networks of safety built in anticipation of a storm we can already feel. The fear that once filled temples now fills laboratories. Different vocabulary, same instinct. Sociologists note another reason the story persists. It offers clarity in chaos. When the world feels unpredictable, the flood myth reduces it to one clean equation: cause, punishment, renewal. It reassures us that disaster has meaning. Even non-believers find comfort in that symmetry. It suggests that suffering is not random, that destruction has purpose, that the water will eventually fall and the rainbow will return. Myth gives shape to uncertainty. Science gives numbers. We crave both. And yet there is something deeper still, something almost genetic. The Ark speaks to the oldest reflex of the species, the need to gather. Before we understood survival as strategy, we understood it as closeness. When danger came, we huddled together. The Ark is that impulse carved into architecture, a roof against chaos, a promise that together we can endure. It is not merely a story about saving the world, it is a story about saving each other. Technology has only intensified the obsession. Modern explorers use drones, LiDAR, and ground-penetrating radar to scan mountains meter by meter. Crowdsourcing platforms let volunteers search satellite imagery from their laptops, marking anomalies that might be planks or shadows. Each click is a prayer in pixels. The myth has gone digital, democratized, decentralized. Anyone with an internet connection can join the hunt. And though the search may never end in discovery, it keeps alive a collective sense of wonder that science alone sometimes forgets. The obsession is not confined to believers. At universities, courses dissect the flood across religions and continents, tracing how one theme threads through hundreds of languages. In literature, writers turn the Ark into metaphor, for exile, for memory, for the smallness of humanity in a changing world. Painters depict it adrift, not on water, but on time itself. Each medium becomes another deck in the same endless vessel. Skeptics often ask, if the Ark is so obviously myth, why waste resources searching for it? But they overlook what the search provides. It gives form to curiosity. It makes invisible history visible again, even if only in imagination. Every expedition to Ararat funds geology, glaciology, mapping. Every sonar scan that seeks a ship records the story of the mountain itself. The quest may never find proof, but it keeps producing knowledge. That is the quiet irony of faith. Its failures often lead to better data. Perhaps the real reason we can't let go is that the Ark promises a moral clarity the modern world lacks. In the story, salvation is simple: build, believe, endure. There are no politics in a storm. Everyone inside the vessel depends equally on its balance. In a fractured, competitive age, that image of unity feels almost utopian. The Ark is the perfect community. One goal, one fate, one hope. And now, as the seas rise again, the metaphor becomes literal. Coastal engineers design floating cities, modular homes that rise with the tide. They do not call them arks, but the lineage is obvious. We are building the same answer to the same question. How do you live when the earth remembers it is fluid? In this light, the Ark ceases to be an artifact of the past and becomes a prophecy. It warns that every civilization eventually meets its flood, whether of water, fire, or data. And it reminds us that survival belongs to those who build before the rain begins. That may be why the legend still stirs unease. It is not only history, it is instruction. Even the language of modern crisis borrows its rhythm. When scientists speak of tipping points and threshold events, they echo the old tone of judgment. When activists call for climate repentance, they are retelling Noah in secular terms. The Ark has become the blueprint for our conscience. At the deepest level, the obsession endures because it resolves a contradiction at the heart of being human. We know we are fragile, yet we crave eternity. We understand that everything changes, yet we build as if it will last forever. The Ark reconciles those opposites. It says, yes, the world will end, but something of you can remain. That promise, that fragile immortality, is irresistible. If one day an expedition does find a structure on Ararat, perfectly preserved beneath the ice, it will not end the story. It will begin another. There will be debates, tests, replicas, pilgrimages. The discovery will divide believers and skeptics exactly as the absence once did. Because the Ark, by its nature, cannot be reduced to certainty. It must remain both found and unfound to do its work, a mystery large enough to hold all our hopes. And so the search continues, half science, half scripture, fueled by the same pulse that once drove the first builders to gather wood before the storm. The difference is only scale. Their flood was water, ours may be data, fire, or climate. But the instinct is unchanged. Somewhere, someone is always preparing an ark. When night falls over Mount Ararat and the snow catches the moonlight, the peak glows faintly like a memory. No explorers climb then, no drones fly. The wind alone speaks across the ice, whispering in the oldest language there is, the language of survival. It says that every generation, no matter how advanced, must learn again what the first survivors already knew. The waters always rise, and the only true ark is the will to begin again. The story of the flood was never meant to stay ancient. It was a warning carved in water, a message sent forward through time, to us. And now the water is rising again. This time there is no single storm, no sudden wall of rain. The new flood is quieter, an inch at a time, tide by tide, news headline by news headline. The catastrophe our ancestors feared arrives not as thunder but as statistics. It comes as warmer nights, heavier monsoons, vanishing ice, drowned coastlines. The end of the Ice Age is no longer a chapter in geology. It is a mirror. From space, satellites watch the planet inhale heat. The Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets bleed meltwater into the sea. Rivers swell earlier each spring. Coral reefs bleach beneath invisible fever. The ocean expands as it warms, lifting itself over seawalls and sidewalks. On maps, new lines appear. Red, digital coastlines marking where the future will touch the present. It is the same pattern that once erased Doggerland, the Gulf oasis, and half the islands of prehistory. We are simply here to see it in real time. In Miami, the sea bubbles up through drains on sunny days. In Venice, tides climb over centuries of stone, turning piazzas into mirrors. In Bangladesh, millions live one storm away from displacement. In the Pacific, nations like Kiribati and Tuvalu prepare to move their entire populations, not because of war, but because of salt. The world's refugees now flee not only violence but geography. Science gives us the numbers: sea level rising 3 millimeters per year, glaciers retreating kilometers per decade, billions of tons of ice vanishing silently into the sea. But numbers cannot convey what it feels like to lose a home that has existed since memory began. In that silence between data points, the old myths return. We recognize them not as fantasy, but as foresight. The same anxiety that once inspired the Ark now shapes our cities. Architects design buildings that float, bridges that lift, streets that drink rain instead of drowning in it. The Netherlands experiments with amphibious housing. Japan builds underground flood tunnels the size of cathedrals. In Singapore, entire neighborhoods are raised above projected tide lines. Civilization itself has begun to behave like a vessel, flexible, watertight, designed to stay afloat no matter how high the waves rise. Climate scientists speak of adaptation, but adaptation is simply the modern name for building arks. Every seawall is a prayer, every policy a plank. And though the tools are different, the psychology is identical. We prepare because we have seen this story before. The floods of today are not punishment, they are consequence. The same warmth that ended the last ice age is now accelerated by our own hands. Carbon, once locked in ancient forests, returns to the air through fire and industry. The greenhouse that once saved us from eternal winter now glows too brightly. The balance between ice and heat shifts again, not over millennia this time, but in decades. The planet's rhythm has become our tempo, and we are playing too fast. Yet the story of the flood has always carried two possible endings: despair or renewal. Even in ancient texts, the waters recede. Life returns. The rainbow, myth's first climate model, symbolizes stability restored. It tells us that destruction is not final, that every deluge hides a chance to rebuild wiser than before. In laboratories and workshops across the world, that hope takes tangible form. Scientists are inventing new ways to live within the storm. Desalination powered by sunlight, algae farms that feed both people and oceans, carbon pulled from air and turned into stone. These are not miracles, they are measurements made merciful. Each innovation is a promise that knowledge can still be a form of rescue. But there is another kind of adaptation, quieter, older, emotional. It is the acceptance that we are part of the same cycle our ancestors survived. They watched seas rise and still built temples. They watched rivers devour their fields and still planted again. They told stories not to escape reality, but to coexist with it. Perhaps that is the wisdom we have forgotten, that survival is not defiance, but partnership. In Greenland, the Inuit have a word, sila, which means both weather and consciousness. It reminds them that the sky has moods, that climate and spirit are entwined. When the ice melts, they say Scylla is restless. It is the same restlessness we now feel on a planetary scale. The story of the flood was never about divine anger. It was about the intelligence of Earth reminding us to listen. As coastlines shift again, archaeologists return to the drowned landscapes of the past, mapping them not only to learn what happened, but to foresee what will. The ruins beneath the Black Sea, the terraces off India, the lost plains of the North Sea. These are not only memorials, they are previews. History has already drawn us a map of consequence. The difference now is that we have the tools to read it. In classrooms, children learn of climate the way their ancestors once learned of gods, through stories that shape behaviour. Perhaps that is where the Ark's true value lies. It turns fear into instruction. It teaches, without lecturing, that the wise prepare before the clouds gather. In this sense, every generation builds upon Noah's blueprint, though our tools are satellites and legislation instead of saws and pitch. The flood of today does not roar. It hums, in data centers, in policy meetings, in silent migration patterns already underway. Yet, beneath the complexity, the core message remains unchanged. Water always wins unless guided. The earth asks not for worship, but for understanding. We can no longer afford to confuse the two, and so the story returns full circle. The ancient flood reshaped the world and forced humanity to imagine survival. The modern flood asks us to do the same, this time knowingly, with foresight instead of fear. The ark that will save us will not rest on mountains. It will float in ideas, engineering, cooperation, empathy. The pitch that seals it will not be tar, but truth. When future archaeologists study our age, they may find skyscrapers under silt, satellites fossilized in orbit, and wonder what story we told ourselves as the seas rose. If we are lucky, they will find traces of preparation, evidence that we remembered the old warnings and acted before the rain began. Perhaps, in their own languages, they will still call it an ark. For now, the choice remains ours. We can continue to debate whether the first ark was real, or we can begin to build the next one, together, in the calm before the storm. When the waters rose in ancient memory, the first instinct was to run. When they fell, the first instinct was to rebuild. That pattern, fear, endurance, renewal, has written itself into our nature. It is why the story of the flood ends not with drowning, but with light. Even in our darkest myths there is always a dawn. What makes the flood different from every other ancient disaster is that it ends in survival. Volcanoes consume, plagues linger, wars divide, but the flood gives something back. It recedes. It allows life to begin again. That rhythm of loss and return is the heartbeat of humanity itself. In the oldest version of the story, the survivor, Ziusudra Utnapishtim, Noah, Manu, does not celebrate victory. He steps from the boat, looks upon a silent world, and weeps. He has carried life through chaos, but he has also become its witness. The world is clean, but empty. It must be repopulated, retaught, relived, and so the real work begins, not surviving the storm, but what comes after. That perhaps is the deeper message of the Ark. Survival is not an ending, it is an invitation. To live after a flood is to rebuild with new understanding. It is a second chance written into the laws of nature. When archaeologists study the layers left by ancient floods, they often find that civilization's greatest leaps followed them. Irrigation, agriculture, architecture, all began in the wake of loss. The flood erased what came before, but it also cleared the slate. Out of the mud, humanity learned to measure, to predict, to prepare. Knowledge itself was the rainbow. In that sense, every age has its deluge. The form changes, water, war, famine, technology, but the moral remains constant. The world begins again when we decide to build differently. The flood is less an event than a test of imagination. It asks not, will you survive, but what will you save? Our ancestors answered with seeds and animals, memories and myths. We answer with data and DNA, satellites and art. Each is a form of continuity, a way of carrying meaning through chaos. Even our most modern technologies, cloud storage, cryogenic vaults, archives floating in orbit, are modern arks, carrying fragments of us into uncertain futures. We build them not only to preserve what we love, but to remind ourselves that life deserves endurance. The flood teaches humility. It reminds us that control is illusion, that the ground we stand on is temporary, that permanence is borrowed time, and yet it also teaches something rarer: hope without naivety. The survivors of myth do not rebuild in arrogance, they rebuild in gratitude. They remember the sound of the water and the silence that followed. They build higher, but also wiser. That is humanity's second chance. Not to escape nature, but to live in rhythm with it. In the book of Genesis, after the flood, the world receives a covenant, a promise that the waters will never again destroy all life. But perhaps that promise was never from the divine to us. Perhaps it was from us to ourselves, a vow to remember, to never again let blindness, greed, or pride make us forget that the world can drown. It is a promise renewed every time a levee rises, every time a species is protected, every time a hand helps another onto higher ground. The flood also teaches equality. Inside the ark, there are no kings or servants, no conquerors or conquered, only passengers. Each life matters, each heartbeat contributes to balance. That image, repeated through millennia, may be the most revolutionary idea ever imagined, that survival depends on cooperation. The ark is not a hierarchy, it is harmony. It floats only when all inside it work together. Modern civilization, for all its brilliance, often forgets this. We have built towers that reach higher than the mountains of Ararat, yet our foundations remain divided. The flood reminds us that division is the first crack in the hull. If the sea rises again, and it always does, the ark that saves us will be collective, not individual. It will be made of unity, not wood. In the quiet of modern disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, pandemics, we glimpse that lesson again. When the lights go out and the water comes, people help strangers. Communities form without command. That instinct is older than civilization. It is the pulse of survival inherited from the first flood. We may argue endlessly in peace, but when the storm arrives, we remember the ark. Even the smallest acts of resilience echo it. A farmer planting after drought, a scientist sharing data freely, a teacher explaining the climate to children not as doom, but as duty. Each is a plank laid across uncertainty. Each is proof that the second chance has already begun. The flood also forces us to reimagine time. To most creatures, a storm is an event. To us, it is a metaphor. We remember, we record, we interpret. Our survival depends not only on endurance, but on meaning. The ark is not a boat. It is an idea. The conviction that the world, however damaged, is still worth saving. This idea threads quietly through all cultures. The Chinese myth of Yu the Great ends not with a flood destroying the world, but with humanity learning to channel it. In Hindu texts, Manu releases the waters back to the sea and begins to cultivate the earth. Even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor does not return to ordinary life. He gains wisdom, the knowledge that immortality lies not in the body but in legacy. Every version of the story arrives at the same moral. Catastrophe is a teacher disguised as chaos, and now the lesson is ours to learn again. We stand at the edge of another transformation, one driven not by gods, but by ourselves. The seas rise, the storms strengthen, the forests burn, but we have knowledge that our ancestors did not. We know what causes the flood, we know how to slow it. The question is not can we, but will we? Perhaps this is why the story still feels urgent. It asks us to choose whether we are builders or bystanders. The first generation built to survive the flood, the next built to prevent it. Our second chance depends on which kind of builders we become, and if history is any guide, we will endure. Humanity has always turned disaster into design. We turned floodplains into farms, caves into cathedrals, storms into songs. Even now, as our technology hums and the horizon glows faintly warmer each year, we continue to adapt. Not perfectly, not quickly, but persistently. The Ark, after all, was not built overnight. When the last of the ancient floods receded, the survivors must have stood in silence, watching steam rise from the drenched earth. In that moment, they were both the end of the old world and the beginning of the new. We stand in a similar silence now, watching data rise like tides, waiting for what comes next. The question is timeless. What will we carry into the next age? Perhaps the answer lies not in discovery, but remembrance. We do not need to find the Ark, we need to become it, to gather what is precious, not just species and seeds, but compassion, wisdom, patience, and carry them through whatever floods may come, to step into the future not with fear, but with the quiet faith that the waters will fall and the world will green again, because they always do, and when they do, we will build again, maybe smaller, maybe humbler, but still building. That is the truest covenant of all. No matter how many times the earth begins again, we will too. The flood is long gone, but its sound remains, not in thunder or rain, but in the rhythms of how we live, build, and believe. It lingers in our architecture, our rituals, our language, a vibration that has never quite faded. Even now, thousands of years later, civilization still moves to the quiet drumbeat of that ancient deluge. Walk through any city on earth and listen carefully. You will hear the same cadence, foundations raised above the ground, walls sloped to shed water, drains designed to mimic the flow of rivers. Each feature is practical, yet together they form something older, a collective memory of instability. We build as if the flood might return tomorrow. We always have. Temples rise on hills. Capitals rest beside rivers, but not within them. Even the earliest cities, Uruk, Memphis, Mohenjo-Daro, stood on artificial mounds. To live above water became a sign of wisdom, to control it, a sign of divinity. The gods of the ancient world were almost always connected to rivers, rain, or sea. Power was measured by the ability to summon or restrain the flood. In Mesopotamia, the god Enlil unleashed the deluge to cleanse the earth, and Enki whispered to a mortal to build a boat. In Egypt, the Nile's annual flood was personified as happy, generous and temperamental. In China, the Yellow River was called the Sorrow of Han, and only the hero Yu could tame it, digging channels to guide its rage. Every civilization began with water and spent the rest of its history negotiating peace with it. Even our rituals, remember. Baptism, the most enduring symbol of renewal in Christianity, is a miniature flood, a death and rebirth through water. In Islam, Ablution before prayer cleanses the body as the flood cleansed the world. In Hinduism, the Ganges itself is a goddess whose flow purifies sin. Every drop is a covenant, echoing the same promise. Water destroys, but also restores. When anthropologists trace the world's myths, they find flood stories in over 400 cultures. No other event, not fire, not famine, appears so universally. Each version carries the same pulse: a rising sea, a chosen few, a return to order. That repetition suggests something deeper than coincidence. It suggests that the flood is not only an event remembered, but a pattern understood, an archetype of transformation. Carl Jung once wrote that myth is the collective dream of humanity. If that is true, then the flood is our recurring nightmare and our recurring hope. It speaks to the fear of losing everything, but also to the relief of beginning again. We dream of it because it is the cycle of life itself: chaos, cleansing, renewal. The story persists because it is, at its core, the story of change. Even language betrays its memory. The words we use for emotion, overwhelmed, flooded, drowned, washed clean, all return to water. Our metaphors for purity and ruin come from the same source. We say time flows, love pours, anger erupts like a storm. The flood did not just shape geography, it shaped grammar. It gave us a way to speak about anything that exceeds our control. Art too has never stopped replaying the flood. From Mesopotamian reliefs to Renaissance canvases to modern cinema, the image recurs: a world half submerged, humans clinging to high ground, light breaking through cloud. Each retelling reflects its era's fears. In ancient days, divine wrath. In modern times, climate collapse. But the composition never changes. We're always at the edge, watching the horizon rise. Perhaps this is because the flood is the purest metaphor for consciousness itself. The sea is the unknown, the unconscious, the depth we fear to enter yet cannot escape. The ark is the mind, fragile, buoyant, carrying fragments of meaning through chaos. When the storm passes, what remains is memory, and the understanding that we are never truly separate from the water. We live within its cycle, even when we think we've escaped it. In this sense, the flood is not about punishment or sin, but awareness. It forces humanity to see its reflection, to recognize that the same element that sustains life can also reclaim it. Every civilization that forgets this eventually relearns it through disaster. Every generation must remember anew that mastery is temporary. The flood is humility written in motion. It is also beauty, because every flood, real or imagined, ends the same way, with stillness. The water shines, the sun returns, the air smells of salt and soil. In that calm, the survivors look out at a world erased and begin to imagine what could come next. That moment, quiet, fragile, endless, is perhaps the most sacred in all of human memory. It is the instant before rebuilding begins. If you look closely, you can see traces of that moment everywhere. In the way people pause after a storm, in the silence before applause, in the collective breath after grief. The flood is not only water, it is the rhythm of every ending and every renewal that has ever touched the human heart. When viewed through this lens, the ark itself becomes less a relic and more a metaphor for consciousness. It is the part of us that remembers amid chaos, that carries the seeds of reason, compassion, and hope through storms of change. Each of us, in our own way, builds one. A small vessel of meaning floating in the vast sea of uncertainty. Even the modern obsession with apocalypse, from films to philosophies, is just the flood returning in new clothes. We no longer fear divine wrath, but we still imagine the earth cleansing itself of our mistakes. And in every version, someone survives. Someone watches the water fall and begins again. That survivor is always us. As the world grows more complex, the flood becomes metaphor once more. Data, noise, speed, emotion. We live submerged in information, carried by currents we barely steer. Our technology has made us oceanic, yet the question remains unchanged. How do we stay afloat? The ark of this age may not be made of wood, but of attention, empathy, truth. The few things still capable of keeping us above the waves. And perhaps that is the final echo of the flood. It never truly ends. It changes form, from water to war, from storm to silence. But it always returns to remind us who we are. A species that remembers, a species that builds, a species that begins again.